What happens when an HOA board member goes too far, cutting a neighbor's lock in broad daylight, only to find herself face to face with a police task force watching the very Jeep she targeted? The sound of metal grinding against metal echoed across the quiet parking lot of the condo complex in Clearwater, Florida. It was early morning, still cool enough that the heat of the day hadn't yet settled in. Most residents were either asleep or just beginning their routines. But at the far corner of the lot, near a row of trimmed hedges, a figure crouched beside a midnight blue Jeep. That figure was Judith Madsen, the HOA board's vice president. With her grey-streaked bob tucked behind her ears and a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters clamped between her hands, she looked more like someone preparing for a break-in than a respected member of the community association. The tool bit hard into the thick metal lock securing the Jeep's wheel. She grunted, pressing her full weight into the handles. A metallic snap rang out. The lock clattered onto the pavement. Judith exhaled sharply, as if she'd just restored order to the neighborhood. "Finally," she muttered. "Now we can get this eyesore out of here." But she wasn't alone. Just a few yards away, two men leaning against a nondescript sedan had been watching everything. Their eyes narrowed the moment the lock broke. They weren't neighbors. They weren't random bystanders. They were plainclothes officers, part of a multi-agency task force that had tagged Adrian Colebrook's Jeep only hours earlier for an ongoing operation. To them, Judith wasn't a rule enforcer. She looked like a saboteur tampering with evidence. "Ma'am, put the cutters down!" one of them barked, striding forward. Judith jumped, her eyes flashing with surprise and irritation. "Excuse me. Who are you to tell me what to do? This is private property. I'm on the HOA board." The man flashed a badge so quickly it silenced the few words she'd been about to say. The other officer closed in, his tone sharp. "Step back from the vehicle." Now, for a second, the world seemed to pause. Judith, caught off guard, tried to hold on to her composure, but her face betrayed her. She was rattled. By then, a small cluster of neighbors had emerged from their doorways, drawn by the voices. Coffee mugs in hand, slippers on their feet, they watched as one of the most recognizable figures in their community was treated like a suspect. And then came another voice, steady, calm, and deep. "What's going on here?" It was Adrian Colebrook, the Jeep's owner. He stood at the edge of the lot in his work clothes, having just come down to head out for his shift. His eyes swept over the scene. His Jeep with a broken lock, Judith with cutters still in hand, and two officers surrounding her. The sight struck him like a blow to the chest. "Are you kidding me?" Adrian asked, his voice cutting through the still air. "That's my car," the crowd murmured. Someone whispered, "She cut the lock?" Another muttered, "She's finally gone too far." Judith straightened up, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Adrian, I thought the vehicle was abandoned. You know the HOA rules. We can't have suspicious cars just sitting around unsecured." Adrian raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Suspicious? You've seen me drive that Jeep every day for years. How exactly is it suspicious?" The officers glanced at each other. They weren't here to mediate HOA politics, but the tension between resident and board member was unavoidable. The senior officer finally spoke. "Sir, your vehicle is tied to an active operation. We've been monitoring it. This individual just interfered with that." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The words "active operation" set off a flood of questions in hushed voices. Was there danger in the complex? Was someone under investigation? Or had Judith just put them all at risk? Judith's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For once, her sharp tongue had failed her. Adrian looked from the officers to his neighbors, then back to Judith. His voice was steady, but loaded with years of quiet frustration. "You didn't think to knock on my door? To ask me? You went straight to breaking locks. This is harassment. Plain and simple." The crowd grew louder now, some siding with Adrian, others mumbling that Judith had a point about enforcing the rules. But no one could deny Adrian Colebrook had never been the type to stir up trouble. If you asked anyone who worked with him at the distribution center in Clearwater, they'd tell you he was steady. Dependable. The guy who showed up on time every morning, handled his shift without complaints, and went home to mind his own business. At 44, Adrian had built a life defined by structure. His job as a supply chain supervisor wasn't glamorous, but it was important. He kept goods moving from warehouses to stores, tracking shipments across Florida, making sure shelves stayed stocked. People often overlooked jobs like his, but Adrian knew the weight it carried. "Without us, people wouldn't even get their groceries," he once joked to his co-workers during a late-night shift. Home, though, was where Adrian found his peace, or at least where he tried to. The condo complex had seemed like a good idea when he bought in 7 years earlier. It was safe, close to work, and quiet enough for him to recharge after long days. The HOA rules had been strict from the start, but he'd figured he could live with it. Everyone had to compromise somewhere. Still, Adrian had his routines. His Jeep, a midnight blue 2015 Wrangler, was more than just transportation. It was the one thing he splurged on after years of saving. He'd customized it with a reinforced lock after someone once tried to break into it outside a grocery store in Tampa. That lock gave him peace of mind. When he snapped it into place, he knew he was protecting something he worked hard for. So when he walked out that morning and saw Judith Madsen standing over his Jeep with bolt cutters, the shock wasn't just about property. It was personal. That Jeep represented his hard work, his independence. Seeing it treated like abandoned junk cut deep. To understand why Adrian reacted the way he did, you had to know the history. Judith wasn't a stranger to him. She'd been on the HOA board nearly as long as he'd lived there, and from the start, she seemed to watch him more closely than she did other residents. At first, Adrian brushed it off. Maybe she was just overly committed to the rules. Maybe she treated everyone the same. But the small things added up. A note slipped under his door about parking within the lines. An email forwarded to him about trash bins being left out too long, when his bin hadn't even been the one at fault. Once she even cornered him in the lobby about music after hours, though Adrian had been at work that night. He remembered their exchange vividly. "Mr. Colebrook," she had said, folding her arms, "we've had complaints about noise from your unit." Adrian had blinked. Confused. "I wasn't even home last night. I was at the warehouse until 2 in the morning." Judith's lips pressed into a thin line. "Well, just make sure it doesn't happen again." That was the thing about Judith. She rarely admitted when she was wrong. Adrian tried to avoid conflict. He wasn't looking for fights, especially not with someone who wielded HOA power. But over the years, he began to notice a pattern. She had energy to spare when it came to policing him, while others seemed to get away with far more. And though Adrian hated to admit it, he'd often wondered if her focus on him had less to do with rules and more to do with who he was. On most days, he swallowed the frustration. He told himself it wasn't worth the stress. He had bills to pay, a family who depended on him, and a reputation at work to protect. But that morning, as he stood in the parking lot staring at the cut lock on his Jeep, years of pent-up restraint simmered dangerously close to boiling over. The officers surrounding Judith only amplified it. They hadn't come for him, but Adrian couldn't help thinking, what if they had? What if Judith's constant suspicion had finally crossed the line into something that could ruin his life? He caught his neighbor, Luis Alvarez, watching from across the lot. Luis gave him a look that seemed to say, "This has gone too far." Adrian nodded slightly in return. He wasn't alone in feeling it. Still, Adrian wasn't reckless. He knew emotions could cloud judgment. That's why, when the officer explained the Jeep was tied to an active operation, Adrian didn't argue with law enforcement. He kept his voice calm, measured, but his eyes told another story, one of exhaustion. One of a man tired of being treated like a problem when all he'd done was try to live his life quietly. And yet, despite everything, Adrian wasn't ready to lash out. He still held on to one thing Judith didn't seem to: patience. But patience has limits, and Adrian was about to find out just how quickly his neighbor's loyalties could shift once whispers started spreading. If you lived in the Clearwater Shores condominiums long enough, you knew who Judith Madsen was. You didn't have to be friends with her, or even speak to her, to learn her reputation. It spread through conversations in the mailroom, whispers by the pool, and sighs exchanged when her name came up at meetings. Judith was the type of person who made her presence known without even trying. At 58, Judith carried herself with the sharpness of someone who believed she was always the smartest person in the room. Her posture was rigid, her tone clipped, and her expression rarely softened. She'd worked in finance before retiring early, something she often reminded neighbors of when money came up in HOA discussions. "I know how to manage budgets," she'd say, tapping her pen against the table as if the rest of the board should just fall in line. For years, Judith thrived on her role as vice president of the HOA board. She treated the position less like a volunteer duty and more like a badge of authority. Where others saw a community, she saw a system of rules to enforce, structures to uphold, and order to impose. If a bike was left in the hallway for more than a few hours, Judith sent an email. If patio furniture didn't match the approved styles, Judith left a notice. If a resident's car looked slightly dusty, Judith took pictures. And she was relentless in meetings. Anyone who dared to challenge her faced a barrage of questions until they either gave in or walked away exhausted. Some residents admired her. "At least she keeps things in check," one neighbor, Sharon Klein, once said. "You know Judith won't let the place fall apart." Others weren't so generous. "She polices this place like it's a military base," Luis Alvarez muttered to Adrian one evening, shaking his head as they stood near the mailboxes. But Judith never seemed to notice the resentment. Or maybe she noticed and just didn't care. To her, she wasn't the villain. She was the protector of property values, the one ensuring standards stayed high. Yet beneath that self-proclaimed duty lurked something harder to ignore. A pattern. Over the years, people began to notice that Judith's watchful eye didn't fall equally on everyone. Adrian wasn't the only one who felt her pressure. Tonya Whitfield, a nurse who lived in the South Building, once came home after a double shift to find a violation notice taped to her door because her welcome mat was too worn. The mat had been on her doorstep for only a month. Meanwhile, another resident in a different building had a cracked doormat that sat outside his door for half a year with no word from Judith. And then there was Paul Donnelly, a retired firefighter who'd once confronted Judith in front of the board. "Judith," he'd said firmly, "you don't enforce rules. You enforce your rules. And you pick your targets." Judith's lips had curled into a tight smile. "Mr. Donnelly, if you have a problem with my methods, you're welcome to run for the board yourself." That was her strategy. Deflect, dismiss, and double down. Still, even with complaints stacking up, Judith maintained her influence. Why? Because she knew the bylaws inside and out. She could quote them like scripture. And in a place where most residents didn't have the patience to argue over fine print, Judith's confidence often carried the day. But there was another layer to Judith that made her even harder to confront. She saw herself as misunderstood. To friends outside the condo, she painted a different picture. "I just care about keeping things nice," she told her sister over coffee one afternoon. "People act like I'm the bad guy, but if it weren't for me, that place would look like a dump." Her sister raised an eyebrow. "You sure you're not going too far?" Judith shook her head, her tone clipped. "No, I'm the only one willing to do what needs to be done." That self-image, protector, not aggressor, was what fueled her the morning she cut the lock on Adrian's Jeep. In her mind, she wasn't vandalizing. She was enforcing. She wasn't targeting Adrian. She was preserving order. But to the neighbors watching her now, it didn't look like order. It looked like obsession. And once plainclothes officers revealed their involvement, the narrative Judith had clung to for years began to crack. The woman who prided herself on control suddenly looked reckless, even dangerous. Still, Judith wasn't the type to back down. Her expression that morning, even when confronted, carried the same stubborn defiance people had seen in every HOA meeting. The problem was, this time, she wasn't sparring with tired neighbors. She was standing in front of law enforcement, and the consequences weren't limited to angry glares or a heated email chain. But the real trouble wasn't what happened in the parking lot. It was what people would. The moment the lock hit the ground, the atmosphere in the condo parking lot shifted. What had begun as a single woman with bolt cutters turned into a scene no one could ignore. People appeared at their windows first, then slowly stepped outside, drawn by the voices echoing through the lot. Adrian stood frozen for a beat, his work bag still slung over his shoulder. His Jeep, the vehicle he relied on for everything from commuting to weekend trips, sat there with its lock sliced open like it was junk metal. And beside it was Judith, bolt cutters in hand, surrounded by 2 officers who were clearly not amused. "You've crossed a line," Adrian finally said, his tone low but steady. His voice carried enough weight to still the murmurs of the neighbors gathering. Judith's cheeks flushed pink. She wasn't used to being confronted like this, not in public. "I told you," she snapped, gesturing toward the Jeep. "This looked abandoned." "It didn't belong here. I was only doing what any responsible HOA officer would do." One of the officers stepped forward, his voice sharp and controlled. "Ma'am, interfering with this vehicle wasn't your responsibility. You've tampered with property tied to an active investigation. Do you understand how serious that is?" Judith's eyes widened. "Active investigation?" She laughed nervously, as if the phrase was exaggerated. "You must be joking." "It's just a car sitting in the lot." The younger officer shook his head. "This isn't a joke. You're lucky we stepped in when we did." By now, nearly 24 neighbors had gathered in a loose circle around the scene. Some whispered in confusion, others muttered about Judith finally going too far. Adrian stepped closer, his gaze fixed on Judith. "You've had it out for me since the day I moved in. And now you think you can cut into my lock like I don't exist? That Jeep is mine." You knew that Judith stiffened, her lips pressing into a tight line. "Don't twist this, Adrian. I was enforcing community standards. Rules matter. If we let one person slide, everyone else will follow." From the back of the crowd, Luis Alvarez raised his voice. "Rules? You didn't even ask him. You just broke the lock like a thief," several neighbors murmured in agreement. Others crossed their arms, siding with Judith. One older man muttered, "Well, at least she cares about the property values. That Jeep's been sitting too long." Adrian spun toward him, his frustration spilling over. "Too long? I parked it last night. I've lived here for years. Do you even hear yourself?" The senior officer lifted a hand, trying to regain control of the situation. "Let's focus. Ma'am, you need to step away from the vehicle. Sir, we'll need you to answer a few questions later. For now, let's de-escalate." But de-escalation wasn't coming easily. The tension had already ignited something deeper, resentments that had been building for years between neighbors, between board members, and now between Judith and Adrian. Judith's voice trembled, though she fought to keep her authority. "You're blowing this out of proportion. I did what anyone would do if they saw something suspicious. This isn't about Adrian personally." Adrian's jaw tightened, his words deliberate. "No, this is personal. You don't treat anyone else here like this. You single me out every chance you get." The crowd fell silent at that, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the humid Florida air. Even those who had quietly defended Judith earlier shifted uneasily. A woman from the second floor, Paula Grant, finally spoke up. "Judith, you've been sending me emails about my plants for months, but you never went after anyone else's. You pick favorites. And targets." Judith whipped around, her face hardening. "This isn't about plants, Paula. Don't drag irrelevant issues into this." But the neighbors weren't listening to her anymore. The focus had shifted. It wasn't just about the Jeep. It was about the way Judith had operated for years, unchecked, her authority rarely questioned. The senior officer glanced at Adrian, then at the crowd. His tone softened slightly. "Sir, I understand this is upsetting. We'll need to document what happened here, and there may be consequences for tampering with your property. For now, though, we need everyone to go back inside. This is still part of an active operation, and we can't compromise it further." Adrian nodded slowly, though his eyes stayed locked on Judith. "I'll answer your questions, but I'm not letting this slide." Not this time. Judith opened her mouth as if to argue, but the wait as the officers escorted Judith a few steps away, the neighbors lingered, buzzing with hushed conversations. Some shook their heads, others whispered theories about the investigation, and a few simply stared at Adrian with sympathy. The lines were being drawn right there in the lot. Some would defend Judith, clinging to the order she claimed to maintain. Others would rally behind Adrian, seeing the morning's events as proof of something they'd felt but never spoken aloud. But as the neighbors drifted back inside, one thing became clear. This wasn't going to stay a parking lot incident. It was about to tear the community in two. By noon, the story had already taken on a life of its own. What started in the parking lot that morning didn't stay there. In a place like Clearwater Shores, word traveled faster than wildfire. By the time Adrian came home from work that evening, people were already choosing sides. At the pool, two retirees, Frank Delaney and Howard Briggs, leaned against the fence, voices low but sharp. "I'm telling you, Judith was right," Frank insisted. "You let one car sit there with a lock on it. Next thing you know, the place looks like a junkyard. She's the only one keeping the line." Howard frowned. "Cutting locks in broad daylight? In front of everyone? That's not keeping the line. That's crossing it." She embarrassed herself, and she embarrassed this community. Adrian heard snippets like this everywhere. At the mailboxes, at the dumpsters, in the elevator. People didn't just talk about the Jeep anymore. They debated what it meant. In the laundry room, Tonya Whitfield overheard two women whispering, "You know she only went after him because it's Adrian," one said. "Come on, you think she cares who owns it?" "She's just obsessed with rules." Tonya shook her head, folding her scrubs. "I've lived here long enough to know the difference. Judith doesn't treat everyone the same. Ask anyone she's targeted." The women went quiet, avoiding her gaze. Meanwhile, Judith wasn't retreating. By that afternoon, she was already emailing the community mailing list. Her subject line read, "Clarification on this morning's incident." The body of the email was long, full of official-sounding language about protecting the integrity of the property and responding to suspicious vehicles. But neighbors read between the lines. Judith didn't apologize. She doubled down, insisting she'd done the right thing and that she was being unfairly vilified. Adrian read the email twice, his jaw tightening. She wasn't just refusing responsibility, she was painting herself as a victim. He tossed his phone onto the couch, frustrated. Later that night, he called Louise. "Did you see her email?" Adrian asked. Louise snorted. "Saw it, deleted it. She's not fooling anyone. Half this complex watched her cut that lock." Adrian sighed. "But some people are siding with her. They think I'm the problem. Let them talk." Louise replied. "You've kept your head down for years. People know you. They know the truth." But Adrian wasn't so sure. Perception mattered, especially in a close-knit community where gossip could turn into reputation. He'd seen how quickly narratives formed, how people repeated what they heard without stopping to question it. At the corner convenience store 2 blocks away, the clerk even brought it up as Adrian paid for a pack of water bottles. "Hey man, you live over at Clearwater Shores, right?" the clerk asked. Adrian hesitated. "Yeah," the clerk smirked. "Heard one of your board members got caught messing with your Jeep." People been talking about it all day. Crazy stuff. Adrian forced a small laugh, but inside he felt his chest tighten. The story wasn't just local. It was bleeding outside the walls of the condo community. Back at the complex, the division became even more obvious. One group of residents congregated near the pool, nodding along as Frank praised Judith's dedication. Another group sat around the courtyard picnic tables, venting frustration about her behavior. "She thinks she runs the place," Paula Grant said, her voice cutting through the chatter. "And we've let her. That's the problem. We've all been too quiet for too long," Tonya added. "She's never once apologized for her mistakes. Not once. This morning proved she'll cross any line to get her way." Adrian sat among them, quiet at first. Finally, he spoke. "I don't want to live in a place where I'm treated like I don't belong. I've done nothing but follow the rules, and still, here we are." The group fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. For them, it wasn't just about Judith's overreach anymore. It was about the kind of community they wanted to live in. But across the pool deck, Judith was holding her own impromptu gathering. She stood tall, her arms folded, surrounded by neighbors who still believed in her. "She's being painted as the villain," Frank said, pointing toward the other group. "But she's the only one who actually cares enough to enforce things. If we lose people like Judith, This place falls apart. Judith nodded, lips pursed. Exactly. People want comfort without responsibility. They don't realize what it takes to keep standards high. The divide was clear, visible, and growing. And Adrian knew something else. When neighbors start to fracture into camps, small disputes turn into long wars. But Judith wasn't just facing whispers anymore. Her next moves would put her reputation, and the HOA itself, under even harsher scrutiny. That night, after the noise of the courtyard died down and neighbors retreated into their condos, Adrian sat alone at his kitchen table. The overhead light buzzed faintly, casting shadows across the bills and unopened mail scattered in front of him. But it wasn't money or paperwork weighing on his mind. It was the day's events replaying over and over like a film he couldn't turn off. He rubbed his temples and stared at the key fob for his Jeep. The image of Judith, crouched with bolt cutters, wouldn't leave him. It wasn't just about the lock. It was the humiliation, the violation of trust, and the fact that it happened in front of his neighbors. For years, Adrian had kept his head down. He believed in staying patient, in not feeding conflict. But now, he wondered if that patience had made him an easy target. His phone buzzed. A text from his sister, Monica Colebrook Price, lit up the screen. Heard about what happened. Louise called me. Are you okay? Want me to come by? Adrian hesitated, then typed back, I'm fine. Just tired. We'll talk tomorrow. But he wasn't fine. He could feel the stress sitting in his chest, heavy and unshakable. Later, unable to sleep, Adrian called Louise anyway. You ever feel like no matter what you do, it's never enough? Adrian asked. Louise exhaled on the other end. All the time, brother. But you can't let her define you. People saw what happened. They know who's right. Some do. Adrian muttered. But others are siding with her. And she's spinning it like I'm the one making a scene. Like I'm the problem. Louise paused. So what are you gonna do? Just let it slide again? That question hit hard. Adrian leaned back, staring at the ceiling. For years, he'd chosen silence. He told himself it was strength, that walking away from conflict was better than feeding it. But silence also gave Judith room to keep pushing. And now it had led here. His property cut open, his reputation questioned. The next morning, Adrian met his cousin Devon Price for breakfast at a diner off Gulf to Bay Boulevard. Devon was younger, more outspoken, and never shy about giving his opinion. Man, you've been letting that woman run over you for years, Devon said, stabbing at his pancakes. I don't know how you stayed this calm for this long. Adrian stirred his coffee, eyes fixed on the dark surface. Because blowing up doesn't fix anything. It just makes it worse. Sometimes you gotta stand up, Devon shot back. You can't keep swallowing this. She cut your lock in broad daylight with half the neighborhood watching. If you don't push back, she's gonna think she can get away with anything. Adrian sighed. I don't want to be the guy who drags this whole place into a fight. People already think I'm angry, or difficult. I don't want to give them ammunition. Devon leaned in, his voice softer. It's not about being angry. It's about respect. If you don't demand it, you'll never get it. The words stuck with Adrian long after breakfast ended. At work that day, he couldn't focus. He walked the warehouse floor, clipboard in hand, but his mind was elsewhere. He replayed conversations, imagined scenarios. What if he called a lawyer? What if he filed a complaint against Judith? What if the HOA board finally turned against her? But each possibility came with risks. Legal action meant stress, money, and the chance of being painted as combative. Complaints might get buried if the board still backed her. And speaking out at a meeting could easily spiral into shouting matches. When he got home, Adrian parked the Jeep and just sat inside, gripping the steering wheel. For the first time, the vehicle didn't feel like a safe place. It felt exposed, like a target. He thought about his parents, about the lessons they taught him growing up in Tallahassee. His father used to say, "Pick your battles, son. Not everything is worth the fight." But his mother always added, "When the fight finds you, don't run from it." Adrian wasn't sure which voice to follow. That evening, a knock came at his door. It was Paula Grant, holding a folder. "I thought you should see this," she said. Inside were copies of HOA violation letters she'd received from Judith over the years. "You're not alone, Adrian. She's been doing this to all of us. The difference is she went public with you. That means she can't hide." By midweek, Judith Madsen was no longer just the vice president of the HOA. She was the woman who'd been caught with bolt cutters in her hands, surrounded by officers, while half the community watched. And no matter how many emails she sent, no matter how carefully she crafted her words, the stain of that morning lingered like smoke after a fire. At first, Judith leaned on her usual tactics. She wrote long, detailed statements filled with official language, community standards, property values, ensuring compliance. She slipped them under doors, posted them on bulletin boards, and blasted them through the HOA email chain. To her, the incident wasn't vandalism. It was a misunderstanding. A duty taken too far, perhaps, but still rooted in her commitment to the neighborhood. But her words landed differently this time. Instead of quiet acceptance or tired eye rolls, her neighbors pushed back. Some sent replies, all emails questioning her authority. Others whispered about filing complaints. And then came the worst blow. An emergency HOA board meeting was scheduled, and her name was at the top of the agenda. The night of the meeting, the community room was packed. Folding chairs scraped against the tile floor as residents filed in, murmuring with anticipation. Adrian sat near the back, quiet but watchful. Paula and Luis sat beside him, offering subtle nods of support. Judith walked in with her shoulders squared and chin lifted, as if she were stepping into a courtroom she expected to win. She carried a binder stuffed with documents, setting it on the table with a loud thump. The HOA president, George Lyman, cleared his throat. He was a soft-spoken man in his 60s who usually preferred to avoid conflict. But tonight, he looked worn down, caught between loyalty to Judith and pressure from the residents. "All right," George began. "We're here to address the concerns raised about the incident last Saturday." "Judith, would you like to speak first?" Judith wasted no time. She stood, adjusting her glasses, and launched into a speech that sounded rehearsed. "I acted in good faith," she declared. "The vehicle in question appeared suspicious. I've reminded this community countless times that we cannot afford to let standards slip. I was simply enforcing what's written in our bylaws." Murmurs rippled through the room. Adrian leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. From the audience, Paula raised her hand. "Enforcing the rules doesn't mean breaking locks on people's property." "That's crossing a line." Judith bristled. "With all due respect, Paula, the line exists to protect all of us. I made a judgment call. Perhaps it wasn't perfect, but I won't apologize for caring about this community." Luis stood up, his voice steady but firm. "Caring about the community doesn't mean targeting people you don't like. We've all seen the pattern. You don't treat everyone the same, and Saturday proved it." Judith's eyes darted to Adrian, then back to Luis. "That's an unfair accusation." Adrian finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "Unfair? Judith, you cut into my property without asking a single question. You embarrassed me in front of neighbors. You endangered an active police operation. Tell me how that's fair." The room went quiet. All eyes were on Judith. For the first time, she faltered. George shifted in his seat, his discomfort obvious. "Judith, we've received multiple complaints about your actions, not just from this incident, but over the past several years. Residents feel singled out. This can't continue." Judith's face flushed. "So what? You're all just going to throw me under the bus? After everything I've done to keep this place from falling apart?" A man from the front row, Howard Briggs, spoke up. "You didn't keep it from falling apart. You divided it. That's the difference." The words hung heavy in the air. Even Judith seemed to feel their weight. George cleared his throat again. "Judith, the board will be reviewing your role and considering disciplinary action up to and including removal from your position." Gasps echoed across the room. Adrian sat back, processing what he'd just heard. For years, Judith had seemed untouchable. But now, for the first time, her authority was crumbling. Judith slammed her binder shut. "This is ridiculous. You're all being manipulated by a handful of complainers. You'll regret this when property values drop and standards collapse." She grabbed her bag and stormed out, the door slamming so hard the frame rattled. The room buzzed with voices immediately after. Some were relieved, others stunned. But most agreed. It was time for change. Adrian stayed quiet, his gaze fixed on the empty doorway. A part of him felt satisfaction. Yes, but another part knew this wasn't over. Judith wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. But while Judith battled her neighbors, another force was closing in, because law enforcement had their own perspective on what she had done, and their patience was running thin. For the officers involved, Saturday morning wasn't just neighborhood drama, it was interference with their work. And in law enforcement, interference could mean danger. The Jeep Adrian parked the night before wasn't chosen by accident. The Clearwater Shores lot had been tagged by a task force that was quietly monitoring a suspect tied to a string of thefts stretching across Pinellas County. The vehicle itself wasn't under suspicion, but it was part of their staging area. The lock on Adrian's wheel was supposed to be a marker, an indication to agents that no one had tampered with it overnight. When Judith cut that lock, she didn't just break a piece of metal. She broke the trust that law enforcement needed to operate in silence. At the Clearwater Police Department the following Monday, Detective Ralph Denning met with his team to review the incident. Files and surveillance notes cluttered the table, but the conversation kept circling back to Judith. "She had bolt cutters?" one officer asked, eyebrows raised. "Full-sized," Denning confirmed. "Went straight at it. No hesitation. If we hadn't been there, she would have had it towed before noon." Another officer leaned back in his chair. "That could have blown the whole operation. If our guy had spotted the tow truck, we'd have lost him." Denning rubbed his forehead. "Exactly. We can't have civilians interfering like this. It wasn't just overstepping, it was reckless. Word of the report spread quickly. While Judith argued about bylaws in community emails, police were drafting paperwork that could carry far more weight than HOA complaints. The possibility of charges, property damage, interference with law enforcement was real. By Tuesday afternoon, an officer knocked on Adrian's door. "Mr. Colebrook," the officer said, holding a notepad. "We're following up on the incident involving your vehicle. Can we get your statement?" Adrian stepped aside, letting him in. He recounted everything he'd seen. The broken lock, Judith's excuses, the officers stepping in. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves. When Adrian finished, the officer closed his notebook. "We may need you to testify if this goes further. Are you comfortable with that?" Adrian hesitated. He'd never been the type to seek the spotlight. But this wasn't about attention. It was about accountability. "If it comes to that, yeah. I'll do it." The officer nodded. "Thank you. You did nothing wrong here. Just know, from our side, this was serious. She's lucky we didn't treat it as obstruction on the spot." After the officer left, Adrian sat at his kitchen table again, staring at the half-empty coffee cup in front of him. He hadn't asked for this fight, but now the police were confirming what he'd felt in his gut all along. Judith's behavior wasn't just irritating. It was dangerous. Meanwhile, Judith wasn't silent. She phoned friends, called relatives, and even visited a lawyer downtown. Sitting across from attorney Clara Winstead, Judith recounted the story with her usual dramatic flair. "They're making me out to be a criminal," Judith huffed. "I was protecting the community." "And now the police are threatening me? Over what, a lock on a car?" Clara listened carefully, jotting notes. "Judith, I need you to understand. Cutting someone else's property, especially when police are involved, is a liability issue. At minimum, you're facing potential civil claims. At worst, criminal charges." Judith's face hardened. "This is absurd. I'm the one who should be pressing charges." "That Jeep was suspicious?" Clara sighed. "Suspicion doesn't give you authority to destroy property. You don't have that power. If law enforcement pursues this, you'll need to prepare for court." For once, Judith didn't have a quick rebuttal. She stared at her hands, fidgeting with her watch. Back at Clearwater Shores, neighbors caught wind of the police angle. Louise told Adrian, "I heard from Frank's wife. Cops might charge her." Can you imagine? Judith, with an actual record? Adrian didn't laugh. "She'll fight it. She won't admit she was wrong." "Not ever," Louise nodded. "Yeah, But maybe this time it's out of her hands. The possibility brought Adrian no joy, only a strange mix of relief and tension. Relief that accountability was finally on the horizon. Tension because he knew how Judith operated. Corner her, and she'd lash out harder. For the task force, the priority remained the ongoing investigation. But Denning made it clear in his report. Civilian interference nearly compromised active surveillance. Recommend formal warning and potential charges to deter similar incidents. It wasn't flashy. It wouldn't make headlines. But for Adrian and his neighbors, it meant Judith's reign of unchecked authority was no longer protected by HOA politics alone. Now, law enforcement was in the picture, and that changed everything. But police pressure wasn't the only storm Judith faced. The community itself was preparing to speak louder than ever, and Adrian would soon be at the center of a public. The emergency HOA meeting 2 weeks later was unlike anything Clearwater Shores had seen in years. Word had spread fast. Flyers slid under doors, emails flying back and forth, whispers traded at the pool and in the parking lot. By the time the meeting started, the community room was packed wall to wall. Folding chairs filled every corner, and still, some residents stood along the back. Adrian sat near the middle, quiet but steady. He hadn't spoken much in the days leading up to this, but everyone knew he would have to say something tonight. On his left, Luis Alvarez gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. On his right, Paula Grant clutched a small stack of HOA violation letters she'd brought as evidence. The room buzzed until George Lyman, the HOA president, tapped the microphone at the front table. His usually calm demeanor carried a nervous edge. "Thank you, everyone, for coming. Tonight, we'll be discussing recent events that have caused division in our community. Specifically, the incident involving board member Judith Madsen and resident Adrian Colebrook gasps, mutters, and sharp intakes of breath rolled through the crowd. All eyes turned toward Judith, seated stiffly at the board's table, binder clutched to her chest like armor. She didn't flinch under the stares. George continued, "We've also been made aware of law enforcement's involvement. This matter has gone beyond our board's authority, but residents have asked for accountability, and we're here to hear your voices." The floor opened, and it didn't take long for Paula to stand. She raised the stack of letters high. "This isn't just about the Jeep. Judith has been doing this for years. I've got documentation of her singling me out for things other residents get away with every day. Worn mats, flower pots, even the color of a chair cushion." A few people clapped. Judith's lips curled into a thin smile. "Enforcing standards isn't targeting, Paula. If you followed the rules, you wouldn't have these letters." From the back, Tonya Whitfield's voice rang clear. "Then why do you ignore violations from your friends, Judith? Why do you look the other way when it's convenient? You've been selective since the day you got this position." The room erupted in murmurs again. Some nodded in agreement, others shook their heads. Adrian finally stood. The chatter died instantly. "I didn't ask for any of this," he began, his tone calm but resonant. "All I wanted was to live here in peace. I follow the rules. I park my car, I pay my dues, I keep my space clean. Yet somehow I've been treated like I don't belong." Saturday morning was the last straw. He turned toward Judith. "You didn't just cut a lock. You cut into my trust. You embarrassed me in front of my neighbors, and you endangered an active police investigation. I've put up with your letters, your warnings, your so-called enforcement for years. But this time, you crossed a line." A hush fell over the room. Adrian's words landed heavy, and even those who'd been defending Judith earlier shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Judith shot back quickly, her voice sharp. "Don't turn this into something it's not. I acted for the good of the community. If that car had been abandoned, if it had been a threat, you'd all be thanking me." "Enough!" Luis Alvarez stood, pointing a finger at her. "We saw what happened." "You didn't ask. You didn't check. You went straight to destruction. That's not leadership. That's obsession." The room broke into applause, drowning out Judith's attempt to respond. Her face reddened, and she slammed her binder onto the table. George cleared his throat, struggling to bring order. Let's remember, this isn't a courtroom. But we have to decide, does Judith still represent what this community wants from its board? One by one, residents spoke up. Some defended her dedication, others recounted their own negative experiences. The air grew heavier with every story, every accusation, every acknowledgement of fear or frustration. Finally, George raised his hand. We'll take a vote. Residents in favor of removing Judith Madsen from the HOA board, raise your hands. Hands shot up across the room, more than half, easily. Gasps and cheers filled the air. Judith sat frozen, her jaw clenched tight. Her eyes darted from face to face, searching for support. But even some of her staunchest defenders hesitated. George sighed. The vote is clear. Judith, you're removed from the board effective immediately. The room erupted again, this time with louder applause, mixed with sighs of relief. Judith stood, her voice shaking with fury. You're all making a mistake. You'll regret this. Don't come crying to me when this place falls apart. She stormed out, the slam of the door echoing like a final note. Adrian remained standing, letting the noise wash over him. He hadn't come here to gloat. He'd come to reclaim his dignity, and tonight, the community had finally seen the truth. But as the cheers faded, Adrian knew this wasn't just about Judith anymore. It was about what kind of neighbors they all chose to be moving forward. The night after the vote, Clearwater Shores was quieter than it had been in weeks. For the first time in years, there were no long HOA emails waiting in inboxes, no sharp reminders slid under doors, no one pacing the courtyards with a clipboard. Judith's absence was felt, yes, but not in the way she'd predicted. The community hadn't fallen apart overnight. Instead, it seemed to exhale, like a neighborhood finally released from a constant state of tension. Adrian walked slowly through the parking lot that evening, his Jeep gleaming under the streetlights. The new lock on the wheel clicked firmly into place, and for once, he didn't feel like he had to glance over his shoulder to see who was watching. He spotted Luis waving from across the lot, and Paula sitting with Tonya near the pool, laughing softly over glasses of iced tea. The heaviness of the last 2 weeks still lingered, but now there was something else. Relief. The next day, George scheduled a follow-up meeting, not to rehash the conflict, but to talk about how they wanted their community to move forward. This time, the mood was different. We can't let this happen again, George began, his voice calm but firm. We've let one person dominate the conversation for too long. If we want a healthy community, it has to be built on trust, respect, and fairness, not fear. Adrian raised his hand. I'm not here to celebrate what happened to Judith. I don't hate her. I just want to live in a place where I'm treated like a neighbor, not a suspect. He paused, scanning the room. We all moved here for the same reason, to feel safe. But safety doesn't come from cutting locks or singling people out. It comes from knowing the person next door respects you enough to talk to you before assuming the worst. Heads nodded around the room. Even some who had defended Judith earlier found themselves agreeing. Paula chimed in. I think we learned something important. Silence isn't neutrality. When we let things slide, we give permission for them to keep happening. We should have spoken up sooner. For Adrian, for Tonya, for all of us. The room grew thoughtful at that, the weight of her words settling in. Afterward, Adrian walked home, the evening breeze carrying the sound of kids playing in the distance. He thought about everything that had happened. The lock, the confrontation, the vote, and now this moment of clarity. He didn't feel victorious. He felt steady, respected in a way he hadn't for years. Later that week, Adrian visited his parents in Tallahassee. Sitting on the back porch, he told his father the whole story. His father leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. You stood your ground without losing yourself. That's the hardest thing to do, son. His mother smiled, her hand resting on Adrian's. And you reminded people of something they needed to hear. That respect isn't optional. It's the foundation of community. Adrian thought about those words long after he drove back to Clearwater. At Clearwater Shores, things didn't transform overnight. Neighbors still disagreed about pool hours, parking spots, and noise complaints. But there was a shift. People started knocking on each other's doors before filing complaints. Conversations that once happened in whispers now took place in the open. Judith? She moved out quietly a few months later. Some said she couldn't handle the embarrassment. Others thought she simply refused to live in a place where her power was gone. Either way, her departure left behind an undeniable lesson. When a community allows one voice to dominate unchecked, it stops being a neighborhood and starts being a dictatorship. But when people finally speak up, together, that's when real change happens. Adrian's Jeep still sat in its usual spot near the hedges. The lock still clamped firmly on the wheel each night. But to him, it wasn't just about security anymore. It was a reminder. Protect what matters, whether it's your property, your dignity, or your right to be treated fairly. And for the residents of Clearwater Shores, that broken lock became a symbol, not of disorder, as Judith had claimed, but of the moment they realized silence wasn't enough. Respect doesn't begin with rules written on paper. It begins with the way you treat the person living next door. If this story resonated with you, remember, every voice matters. Speak up for fairness, protect your peace, and don't be afraid to hold people accountable. And if you want more stories that challenge, surprise, and remind us of life's lessons, make sure to subscribe.